pressure of her hand against my hip bone wasn't decreasing. The stretch was over. I knew the mechanics of this movement better than I knew my own apartment. But Patty hadn't pulled away. The sharp, tearing sensation of the muscle release had faded into a dull, heavy warmth. Yet the weight of her palm remained fixed, anchoring me to the mat. The silence in the recovery room shifted. It wasn't the empty quiet of the gym anymore. It was thick, charged with the sound of our synchronized breathing, and the question that had been hovering between us for months, waiting for the oxygen to ignite it. To understand why her hand on my hip felt like a seismic event, you have to understand the silence we built to get here. The high-end fitness club at 10 p.m. is a cavern of steel and shadows. The daytime crowd, the influencers filming content, the networking tech bros, they're all gone. What's left is the industrial hum of the HVAC system and the smell of rubber mats and antiseptic cleaner. It's a sterile, echoing cathedral for people who need to exhaust themselves to sleep. I come here to stop talking. My day job is crisis PR. I spend 12 hours a day spinning narratives, softening blows, and managing the reputations of people who probably don't deserve it. My life is a constant stream of calculated words and strategic empathy. By the time I walk through these glass doors, I am sick of the sound of my own voice. I crave the honesty of gravity. Iron doesn't care about your press release. 200 pounds is 200 pounds, no matter how you spin it. Patty is the only other regular at this hour. She's a trauma surgeon at the university hospital. She spends her shifts holding lives together with sutures and sheer will, making life or death decisions in seconds. When she comes here, she isn't looking for a chat. She isn't looking to process her trauma or unload the weight of the patients she couldn't save. She's looking for something she can control absolutely. A barbell doesn't bleed. A deadlift doesn't have complications if you execute the form with precision. For 8 months, this was our arrangement, the non-verbal agreement. We didn't exchange numbers, we didn't get drinks, we barely exchanged names until the 3rd week. We just spotted each other. It was a partnership born of mutual, high-functioning exhaustion. We recognized the specific frequency of burnout in each other's eyes, that glazed, hard look that says, if I stop moving, I might shatter. Most people can't handle the silence we shared. They feel the need to fill it with complaints about the weather or the music. But Patty and I, we let the silence stretch. It was a luxury. In that vast, empty gym, with the mirrors reflecting nothing but our own exertion, we were alone together. The isolation was the point. We created a vacuum where the only things that mattered were the rep count and the rack. I'd watch her from the corner of my eye as she chalked her hands, methodical, clinical, dusting the white powder over her calluses like she was prepping for surgery. She never rushed. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion, no wasted energy. And she offered me the same grace. She didn't ask me how the scandal with the senator was going. She just watched my bar path, nodded when the depth was good, and stepped in only when I was about to fail. It was the most intimate relationship I had, precisely because it demanded nothing from me but my physical effort. We were 2 heavy planets orbiting the same sun, keeping a safe, respectful distance. The gym floor itself became a 3rd character in this silent play. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, constant note that vibrated in your teeth if you stood still too long. The air was always cool, kept at a precise temperature to discourage lingering, but between us, the heat built. It wasn't sexual, not at first. It was the heat of friction. 2 high-performance engines running at redline in the same garage. I found myself timing my sets to hers, syncing our rest periods so we occupied the same quadrant of the free weight section. It was accidental, I told myself. Just logistics. But looking back, I was already drafting the contract for what happened tonight. I was already leaning into the gravity of her presence, waiting for the moment the orbit would decay and we'd finally collide. The rivalry wasn't something we ever discussed. It was a Cold War, fought in 5-pound increments. If I loaded 25s, Patty silently slid 30s onto hers. She wouldn't look at me. She would just adjust her ponytail, chalk up, and execute the lift with a terrifying stillness. It was petty and absolutely essential to my sanity. We didn't high-five. We didn't spot each other with encouraging shouts. We communicated through the aggressive addition of iron plates, a silent conversation about dominance that kept us both coming back every night. I studied her biomechanics like a political dossier. Patty lifts like a surgeon. There is no wasted movement, no grunt of effort, no struggle. She approaches the bar with the same terrifying calm I imagine she brings to the operating theater. Her hands position themselves with absolute symmetry. Her breath is a measured, regulated metronome. When she pulls, the bar doesn't jerk, it glides. It travels in a perfect vertical line, defying physics through sheer, disciplined will. I fixated on the way her muscles shifted under her shirt, the precise engagement of her lats, the way her deltoids flared with the effort. It's infuriating. It's beautiful. My style is different. I lift like I'm putting out a fire. I rely on explosive power, on the adrenaline of the day's disasters fueling the movement. I attack the weight. I want to feel the struggle, the shake, the moment where I might fail but don't. Patty is endurance and precision. I am torque and velocity. We are the perfect inverse of one another, and that contrast created a magnetic field that filled the empty gym. The mirrors are the most dangerous equipment in the room. They are everywhere, floor-to-ceiling sheets of glass designed to correct your form. But at 10 p.m., they become tools of surveillance. I would catch her in the reflection. I'd be resting between sets, chest heaving, sweat cooling on my skin, and I'd see her eyes in the glass. She wasn't checking her squat depth. She was watching me. And she didn't look away when our eyes met in the reflection. That was the thing that shifted the ground beneath us. Most people, caught staring, flinch. They'll pretend to look at the clock or check their phone. Patty never flinched. Her gaze was unflinching, assessing, heavy. It felt like a tactile thing, a hand running down my spine, measuring the curvature. In those moments, the air between the racks thickened. It wasn't just competition anymore. The competition was a cover story. We were using the weights to justify the staring. We were using the rivalry to channel a fascination that we didn't have the language for. If I added weight to the bar, it wasn't just to beat her. It was to make her look. I wanted to impress her. I wanted the trauma surgeon, the woman who had seen the worst of the human body, to look at my strength and find it worthy. Tonight, the dynamic felt sharper. The usual buffer of the cleaning crew was gone. It was just us, the hum of the lights, and the sound of iron clanking against the rubber floor. I could feel her presence behind me even when I wasn't looking. It was a pressure change in the room. Every time she moved, I tracked it. Every time she exhaled, I heard it. We were circling each other, trading sets like we were trading secrets, pushing the limits of our bodies because it was the only way we knew how to touch without touching. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we were too professional to say. And I knew, with a sudden, jarring clarity, that the weights were getting too heavy to hold up the walls we had built. Tonight, the focus was sumo deadlifts. It is a movement that demands a specific kind of arrogance. You have to believe you can move the earth just by pushing your feet into it. I started loading the bar. The 45-pound plates slid onto the sleeve with a heavy, satisfying thud. 1, 2, 3 on each side. Then the change plates. It was near my max, a weight that required perfect neurological firing. If I missed the groove by an inch, I wouldn't just fail, I would crumble. The atmosphere in the room tightened. It was a physical sensation, like the air pressure dropping rapidly before a storm breaks. Patty stopped her own workout. She was doing pull-ups, her body a perfect vertical line, but she dropped from the bar as I chalked my hands. She didn't ask if I needed her. She just walked over. She stood at the edge of the platform, just inside my peripheral vision. She was close enough that I could see the rise and fall of her chest, close enough that if I fell backward, I would collide with her. Her presence was a tangible weight, heavier than the iron on the bar. She stood with her arms crossed, her biceps flexing slightly against her chest, her gaze fixed on my setup. She was the surgeon observing the procedure, waiting for the hemorrhage. I stepped up to the bar, the knurling bit into my palms, sharp and familiar, a steel bite that promised calluses tomorrow. I wedged my hips in, forcing my knees out, dropping my center of gravity until the tension in my hamstrings was a tight, singing wire. I took a breath. I packed the air into my stomach, bracing against the belt, creating a cylinder of pressure. The world narrowed. There was no PR crisis, no emails, no noise. There was only the physics of the lift. I pulled the slack out of the bar, that metallic click that signals the engagement of the system. Drive, I told myself. I pushed the floor away. The bar broke contact with the mat, hovering, heavy, and reluctant. My vision tunneled. The strain was immediate and total. It wasn't just my legs. It was every fiber of the posterior chain screaming in unison. The weight moved up my shins, scraping the skin, a slow, grinding ascent. I could feel the blood pressure spiking behind my eyes, a rhythmic thumping that drowned out the gym's playlist. I hit the sticking point just below the knees. The bar stalled. My muscles began to seize, vibrating violently. The easy thing would be to let go, to let the crash happen. But I couldn't let go, not with her watching. I could feel her eyes tracing the struggle, analyzing the breakdown of my form. I wasn't just lifting a barbell. I was lifting her expectation of me. I was proving that I belonged in this sanctuary of discipline. I heard a sound from her direction, a sharp, sympathetic intake of breath through her teeth. She knew this pain. She knew exactly what this moment felt like, where the will has to override the biology. That sound pushed me over the edge. I grinded through the stall. I drove my hips forward with a violence that felt dangerous, locking my knees, pulling my shoulders back until the joints stacked. I stood there at the top of the mountain. My body was shaking, a tremor running from my ankles to my neck. My grip was slipping, my fingers opening by millimeters. But I held the lockout. I held it for a count of 3, staring straight ahead into the mirror, seeing my own face distorted by effort, and behind me, her reflection. She wasn't looking at the bar. She was looking at my hands. The moment stretched out, suspended in the high-tension wire of the room. Absolute, terrifying, and heavy. The descent is where the discipline lives. That's what I tell myself. I hinged at the hips, guiding the steel back to the floor, fighting gravity every inch of the way. But halfway down, the rebellion started. It wasn't a gradual fatigue. It was an ambush. A sharp, white-hot seizure tore through my right hip flexor, feeling less like a muscle cramp and more like a cable snapping under impossible tension. The signal from my brain to my leg was simply cut. My knee buckled. The bar crashed the last 6 inches, a cacophony of metal on rubber that sounded like a car wreck in the silent room. I didn't stand up. I couldn't. I crumpled, clutching my side, a hiss of pain escaping through my clenched teeth that I couldn't suppress. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered on the platform next to the chalk bucket. I was the crisis PR expert, the woman who spins disasters into victories, and I was reduced to a wincing, gasping mess on the floor. The humiliation was immediate and acidic, burning hotter than the knot in my hip. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the wave of spasm to pass, praying that when I opened them, she would be gone. But in Patty's world, when a body fails, you don't look away. You move in. I didn't hear her approach. I just felt the sudden, authoritative displacement of air, and then she was there. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" That is a civilian question, a useless pleasantry. She knelt beside me, her knees hitting the platform with a heavy thud. Her hands were on me instantly. Not the tentative, polite touch of a stranger, but the firm, diagnostic grip of a surgeon assessing damage. One hand clamped onto my shoulder to stabilize me. The other hovered over the hip, checking the alignment, reading the tension through the fabric of my leggings. "Breathe," she commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a medical order delivered with the same absolute certainty she probably used in the ER trauma bay. "Don't try to straighten it yet." I tried to wave her off. My pride was screaming louder than my psoas. I was the iron woman, the rival, the equal. I wasn't a patient. "I'm fine," I gritted out, the lie tasting like bile and chalk dust. "Just a cramp. I just need a second." I tried to push myself up, to reclaim some shred of dignity, to stand on my own 2 feet and prove that I wasn't broken. I put weight on the right leg, and the muscle seized again, violent and unforgiving. I would have hit the floor a second time if she hadn't caught me. And that was the moment the contract burned. Her arm hooked around my waist, hauling me up, taking my full weight against her own body. The contact was shocking. For 8 months, we had maintained a force field of 3 feet, a sterile zone of professional distance. Now, I was pressed against her side, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of her core. She smelled of peppermint soap, the metallic tang of old iron, and the heat of her own exertion. It was overwhelming. The barrier was breached, and the physical reality of her was sudden and undeniable. "Stop fighting me," she said, her voice right at my ear. It was low, calm, and utterly terrifying. "It's a spasmed psoas. If you try to walk on it, you'll tear it. Do you want to be out for 6 weeks, or do you want to listen to me?" She didn't wait for an answer. She shifted her grip, pulling my arm over her shoulders, locking her hand around my wrist to secure me. Her fingers were rough, calloused, and hot against my skin. Recovery room. Now. I looked at her then. Really looked at her from this new, forced proximity. The rivalry was gone from her eyes. The cold assessment was gone. In its place was a fierce, protective focus that made my breath hitch in my throat. I nodded, a jerky, defeated movement. I let myself lean into her, surrendering the weight I couldn't carry. We began to move, a slow, synchronized shuffle across the gym floor, leaving the loaded barbell behind as a monument to the collapse of my control. Crossing the threshold into the recovery suite felt like stepping out of a blast zone and into a decompression chamber. The transition was jarring in its abruptness. One moment, we were navigating the harsh, industrial reality of the main floor, the clatter of plates, the aggressive fluorescent glare, the smell of effort and chalk dust. And the next, the world fell away. The recovery room at this club is an architectural apology for the brutality of the workout floor. It is designed to trick the nervous system into submission. The air here is different. It's kept 5 degrees cooler, a crisp, artificial chill that hits the sweat on your skin and makes you shiver. The smell is aggressive in its own way. Not the honest stink of iron, but a thick, pervasive cloud of eucalyptus and lavender pumped through a separate ventilation system. It's the scent of forced relaxation, a chemical signal that the war is over. Patty navigated us through the door, her arm still clamped firmly around my waist. She didn't struggle with my weight. She moved with a frightening stability, her core engaged, absorbing the imbalance of my limping gait. I was hyper-aware of the heat radiating from her side, a furnace against my ribs that the cool air of the room couldn't touch. She kicked the door shut with her heel. The sound was a soft, heavy thud, followed by the distinct click of the magnetic latch engaging. That sound changed everything. It sealed the container. Out on the floor, even when we were alone, there was the theoretical possibility of intrusion. A late-night cleaner, a forgotten keycard, the wandering security guard. But in here, with the door closed and the heavy soundproofing panels lining the walls, we were completely severed from the outside world. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. "Down," she instructed, guiding me toward the corner of the room where the thickest mats were laid out. She lowered me with a precision that bordered on choreography. She didn't just drop me. She controlled the descent, her hand sliding from my waist to my arm, then to my back, ensuring I didn't jar the hip. As soon as I was seated, she stepped back. The loss of contact was immediate and cold. I felt the absence of her support like a draft in a poorly insulated house. I leaned back against the wall, stretching my good leg out, wincing as I adjusted the bad one. I watched her move. In the main gym, Patty is a creature of rigid lines and vertical power. Here, in the dim, amber light of the recovery suite, she seemed to shift gears. The lighting in here is low, coming from recessed fixtures near the floor rather than the ceiling, casting long, soft shadows that blurred the sharp edges of her silhouette. She walked to the equipment rack on the far wall. I watched the muscles in her back shift under her shirt as she reached for a foam roller and a resistance band. She wasn't rushing anymore. The urgency of the rescue had faded into a deliberate, methodical calm. She was in her element now, not as the competitor, but as the mechanic. I felt a spike of vulnerability that had nothing to do with the injury. I hate this room. I avoid it on principle. My job is about control, controlling the narrative, controlling the crisis, controlling the spin. This room is built for surrender. It's built for admitting that something hurts, for rolling out the knots, for yielding to the damage. Lying here, unable to stand without help, watching my professional rival gather the tools to fix me, I felt the carefully constructed architecture of my ego beginning to groan under the strain. Patty turned back, holding the black foam cylinder like a weapon. She caught me watching her. The shadows cut across her face, hiding her eyes, but highlighting the set of her jaw. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a reassuring platitude about how it happens to everyone. She just walked toward me, entering my personal space with the terrifying confidence of someone who knows exactly how to take you apart and put you back together. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the eucalyptus scent suddenly cloying, as the distance between us closed to zero. I arranged myself on the mat, trying to find a posture that felt less like a sacrificial offering and more like a focused athlete engaging in maintenance. It was nearly impossible. Lying on my back, with one leg drawn up and the other uselessly splayed, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the spandex I was wearing. The dim lighting just made the space feel conspiratorial. It turned the recovery room into a confession booth, where the sin was weakness and the penance was touch. Patty knelt beside me. She didn't sit. She knelt on one knee, a position of leverage and readiness. She was close enough that I could see the fine sheen of sweat on her collarbone, close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of her laundry detergent beneath the gym smells. She paused. For the first time all night, she hesitated. Her hands hovered inches above my leg, suspended in the cool air. She looked at me, her eyes dark and unreadable in the shadows. It was a silent request for clearance. In the gym, we spotted each other, but we didn't handle each other. This was a violation of the treaty. I looked at the ceiling and gave a stiff, barely perceptible nod. Then her hands descended. The contact was a shock to the system, violent in its gentleness. Her left hand cupped my heel, lifting the leg, while her right hand settled firmly on my quad. Her hands were hot. That was the first thing that registered, an intense, radiating heat burning through the fabric. They were rough, too. I knew they would be. I had watched her deadlift without straps for months. I knew the texture of her palms would be mapped with calluses, hardened by the same iron that had hardened mine. Feeling that texture against my own body sent a shiver racing up my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold air. "Relax," she murmured. It was less a command this time and more of a coaxing. She began to manipulate the joint. She rotated my leg inward, testing the range of motion. It was clinical. It was a medical examination performed by a trauma surgeon who understood the human skeleton. But my brain refused to categorize it that way. Every nerve ending in my lower body seemed to wake up and start screaming at once. The sensation was a confusing, muddy mix of sharp pain from the injury and a heavy electric awareness of her skin on mine. She slid her hand higher. My breath hitched. I couldn't help it. Her palm moved up the expanse of my thigh, her thumb digging into the IT band, tracing the line of tension up toward the hip flexor. It was an intimate geography. She was touching parts of me that no one had touched in a very long time, and certainly not with this kind of authority. She claimed the space. Her fingers pressed deep into the muscle belly, finding the knot with a terrifying accuracy. "Here?" she asked, pressing down. "Yes," I gasped, the word escaping as a hiss. "It's tight," she observed, her voice detached. "You're guarding. You're fighting me." I was. I was fighting her with everything I had. Not physically. My leg was heavy in her grasp, but emotionally. I was building walls as fast as she was dismantling them, trying to spin this as a necessary therapeutic intervention. But the body doesn't lie. The body knows when it's being held. She shifted her weight, leaning over me to get better leverage. Her other hand moved from my ankle to my lower back, sliding under the curve of my spine to stabilize the pelvis. The sensation of her hand sliding underneath me, lifting me slightly to press me into the mat, broke my focus entirely. It felt grounding. It felt possessive. She had me pinned between the floor and her own strength, caught in a vice of her making. "You're holding your breath," she said softly. Her face was hovering above mine now, close enough to feel the warmth of her exhale. She wasn't looking at my leg anymore. She was looking at my face, watching the micro expressions of pain and panic flit across my features. Let it go. You can't release the muscle if you don't release the breath. I realized my lungs were burning. I had been holding the air in my chest like a shield, as if breathing would somehow make this real. But it was already real. The danger wasn't the injury. The danger was the way her thumbs circled the hip bone, the way her weight pressed me down, the way the silence wrapped around us. I let the breath go. It came out as a long, ragged sigh that sounded far too much like an absolute surrender. Turn over. The command was soft but absolute. I didn't argue. I rolled onto my stomach, the mat cool against my flushed cheek, and let her guide my right leg up. She positioned it with maddening care, bending the knee, angling the shin, the pigeon pose. It is a position of total submission, a biomechanical surrender where you simply fold yourself in half and pray the joint opens before it snaps. She didn't just push with her hands this time. She used her leverage. I felt the mat depress as she shifted closer, her knee pressing into the floor beside my hip to block my escape. Then she leaned in. She brought her upper body down over mine, using her own mass to drive the stretch deeper. It was a canopy of heat. She was hovering inches above me, her chest parallel to my back, her arms braced on either side of my head like pillars. I was enclosed in her space. The world narrowed down to the dark rectangle of the mat and the overwhelming, heavy presence of Patty pressing me into the earth. "Breathe into it," she whispered. Her voice didn't just reach my ears, it vibrated through my ribcage. She applied the pressure. It was a slow, tectonic shift. The sensation in my hip was a blinding flare of white light, the muscle screaming as it was forced to lengthen. But it was immediately chased by something else, something darker, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. The pain was sharp, yes, but the weight of her body on mine was a drug. It was the crushing, grounding pressure of a gravity blanket made of bone and muscle. The lines began to blur. The sharp bite of the injury mixed with the heavy, narcotic pleasure of being held down. I couldn't tell where the therapy ended and the intimacy began. I stopped trying to categorize it. I stopped trying to be the crisis PR expert who manages a story. I just let go. I melted. That's the only word for it. The tension that had held my body rigid for 8 months, the armor I wore to compete with her, the stiffness of the rivalry, it all just dissolved. I sank into the floor, and as I sank, she followed me down. She didn't pull back. She deepened the contact, her hand sliding from my shoulders to my lower back, pressing, holding, anchoring me to the spot. The room fell away. The smell of eucalyptus, the hum of the lights, the concept of the gym, it all evaporated. There was only the rhythm. In, out. I realized with a jolt that we were synchronized. My ragged, shallow gasps had slowed, matching the deep, tidal pull of her breathing. I could feel her diaphragm expanding against my back. We were breathing the same air, sharing the same cadence. It was a level of attunement that usually takes years to build, and we had stumbled into it in minutes. The air between us grew heavy. It wasn't just humidity or sweat. It was charged with static. It was the density of everything we hadn't said since the day she walked in. Every stolen glance in the mirror, every extra plate on the bar, every moment of our silent contract was condensing right here, in this room, pressing down on us. She shifted slightly, her hand slipping from my lower back to rest heavily on my hip bone. Her thumb brushed the waistband of my leggings, a touch that was technically corrective but felt terrifyingly possessive. She wasn't fixing a patient anymore. She was holding me, and I was letting her. The silence stretched impossibly tight, a rubber band pulled to its absolute breaking point, vibrating with the terrifying electric realization that neither of us wanted to move. The stretch was over. The muscle had released. But she didn't leave. The cramp had ghosted. The sharp, biting, seizing of the muscle fiber had smoothed out into a dull, manageable hum. Biomechanically, the transaction was complete. The patient was stabilized. By every rule of the gym, by every clause in the silent contract we had drafted over 8 months of sweating side by side, this was the moment she should have pulled back. She should have retreated to the safe, sterile distance of the squat rack. But She didn't move. That was the shift. The stillness that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Her hand remained fixed on my hip bone. It wasn't pressing down for leverage anymore. It was just resting there. Heavy. Hot. Claiming the territory. It felt less like a therapeutic hold and more like an anchor, keeping me pinned to the floor so I wouldn't float away on the sudden, dizzying rush of adrenaline. I lay there, face pressed into the mat, listening to the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. It was loud, traitorously loud. I wondered if she could feel the heat rising off my skin, flushing at my neck, betraying the cool, professional facade I had spent a decade perfecting. The dynamic in the room tilted on its axis. Gravity seemed to change direction. For months, we had been repelling each other, two magnetic poles of identical charge pushing apart to maintain our orbit. Now, the polarity had flipped. The force pushing us apart was gone, replaced by a terrifying, inevitable pull. We weren't the crisis PR expert and the trauma surgeon anymore. We were just two women in a locked room, stripped of the iron and the noise that we used to protect ourselves. It released, I whispered. My voice sounded foreign, rough and low, scraping against the silence. It was an attempt to drag us back to the safety of anatomy. I know, she replied. Her voice came from directly above me, a vibration that I felt in my spine. She didn't move her hand. If anything, the pressure increased slightly, her thumb brushing a slow, deliberate arc against the waistband of my leggings. I can feel it. She wasn't talking about the muscle. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The eucalyptus scent suddenly felt cloying, intimate. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, her knee against the mat near my thigh, the warmth of her torso hovering over my back, the absolute unwavering weight of that hand on my hip. She shifted then, but not away. She leaned in closer, the movement subtle, a shift of leverage that brought her lips inches from my ear. I could feel the ghost of her breath, warm and steady, against the sensitive skin of my neck. Hey, she said. It was soft, barely a sound, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. I turned my head. It was a slow, reluctant movement, grinding against the friction of the mat. I looked up. She was there, filling my field of vision. The shadows cut across her face, but her eyes were clear. They weren't the cold, assessing eyes of the rival. They were dark, dilated, and terrifyingly open. She was looking at me with a raw, unflinching hunger that stripped me bare. Are we still just partners? The question hung in the air, suspended between us like a guillotine blade. It was precise. It was surgical. It cut through 8 months of pretense in 5 words. It destroyed the plausible deniability we had carefully constructed with chalk dust and silence. I looked at her, and the realization hit me with the force of a failed lift. The rivalry, the competition, the staring in the mirror. It hadn't been about the weights. It had never been about the weights. It was a long, complicated, aggressive foreplay. We hadn't been fighting for dominance. We had been fighting for this. I didn't answer immediately. Words felt too light, too flimsy to bridge the gap that had just opened up between us. In my line of work, I use words to deflect, to reshape reality, to keep the truth at a manageable distance. But here, on the floor of the recovery room, with the smell of eucalyptus thick in my lungs and Patty's hand burning a brand into my hip, there was no spin left. The only answer that mattered was kinetic. I moved. It was a slow, deliberate rebellion against the passive position I'd been holding. I engaged my core, wincing slightly as the ghost of the cramp flickered in my hip, and turned over. The friction of the rubber mat against my skin was a grounding sensation, a reminder of the physical world as I rotated to face her fully. I didn't retreat. I didn't scramble backward to reestablish the safety perimeter. I turned into the heat. Now we were face to face, lying on our sides, the distance between us measured in inches. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, carving out a private space that existed solely for us. I looked at her, really looked at her, without the mediation of a mirror or the safety of a barbell between us. The unflinching gaze I had tracked for months was right there, magnified. But up close, the aggression I had always read as rivalry looked different. It wasn't a challenge to compete. It was a challenge to connect. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, dark pools of adrenaline and intent. She looked terrified, and she looked absolutely certain. "Are we?" she whispered again, the question vibrating in the small space between our mouths. Her hand had slid from my hip to my waist as I turned, her thumb now resting against the bare skin just above the waistband of my leggings. The touch was heavy, possessive, anchoring me to the moment. I reached out. My hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I traced the line of her jaw. Her skin was hot, damp with the sweat of the workout we had both abandoned. "Patty," I said, the name feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. We rarely use names. "I think we stopped being partners the day you walked in." The confession hung there for a heartbeat, stark and undeniable. Then the gravity won. She didn't hesitate. She closed the distance, and the collision was absolute. It wasn't a tentative, testing kiss. It was a claiming. Her mouth met mine with a force that knocked the breath out of me, a collision of intent that had been building pressure for 8 months. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy with the texture of months of repression. She tasted of salt and exhaustion, of the bitter electrolytes she drank during sets, and of something sharper, pure, unadulterated want. I felt a sound escape my throat, a low, desperate noise that I couldn't suppress, and she swallowed it. Her hand at my waist tightened, pulling me flush against her. The contact was electric. The solid, unyielding wall of her chest pressed against mine, the fabric of our gym shirts creating a friction that felt like sparks flying. This wasn't the frantic fumbling of strangers trying to figure each other out. This was the precise, heavy connection of two women who already knew the map of each other's bodies. I knew exactly how strong she was, and now I felt that strength directed entirely at me. I tangled my fingers in her ponytail, the tie snapping loose, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders and creating a curtain that shut out the rest of the room. I felt the muscles in her shoulders bunch under my palms, traps and deltoids carved from stone and discipline. But under my touch, they weren't rigid. They were shifting, working, alive. She kissed me like she lifted, with total focus, with an intensity that demanded everything I had. It was a deep, searing exploration that wiped my mind clean of deadlines, press releases, and spin. There was no narrative here. There was only the pressure of her lips, the heat of her body, and the terrifying realization that I had been starving for this specific hunger. I pulled her closer, my leg hooking over hers, the injury forgotten in the rush of dopamine. The pain in my hip was replaced by a different kind of ache, a heavy, pooling warmth that settled low in my belly. We were a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing, the silence of the recovery room shattered by the wet, desperate sound of our mouths moving together. It felt inevitable. It felt like the final rep of the heaviest set of my life, the point where you either break or you become something stronger. And as her hand slid up my back, pressing me into her, I knew we weren't breaking. We were finally, perfectly aligning. We broke the kiss, but we didn't break the circuit. We pulled back just enough to breathe, our foreheads resting against each other, creating a small, private bridge in the dim light. The air in the recovery room rushed back in to fill the space between us, cool, scented with eucalyptus, and humming with the mechanical noise of the ventilation. But it couldn't cool the heat radiating between our bodies. My hands were still gripping her shoulders. Her arm was still a steel band around my waist. The silence that settled over us wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of the last 8 months. It was the quiet of a treaty finally signed. "Your hip," Patty murmured, her voice rough, vibrating against my skin. She didn't move away. She stayed right there, in my space, her eyes scanning my face with that terrifying clinical intensity, checking for regret. "It's fine," I lied, though the dull ache was a distant memory compared to the electricity firing through my nerves. "It's not fine," she corrected, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth. "But you'll live." She pulled back then, the loss of contact feeling like a physical blow. She stood up first, moving with that fluid, efficient grace, and reached a hand down to me. I took it. There was no hesitation this time, no calculation of dominance. She pulled me up, taking my weight until I was steady on my feet. We stood there for a moment, two women in disheveled gym gear, breathing hard in a room designed for relaxation, the wreckage of our rivalry scattered around us like the chalk dust on the floor. Walking out of the recovery suite felt like stepping onto a different planet. The main gym floor was exactly as we had left it. The barbell still loaded on the platform, the mirrors still reflecting the empty racks. But the context had shifted tectonically. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was just a room full of metal objects. The tension that had made the air vibrate for months was gone, replaced by a solid, grounding connection. I looked at the squat rack, where we had spent hours ignoring each other, and it seemed almost ridiculous now. All that posturing, all those plates added in anger, just to avoid admitting that we wanted to be close. We walked to the exit in silence, but it was a companionable silence. We moved shoulder to shoulder, the distance closed. I could feel the warmth of her arm brushing against mine with every step. We pushed through the glass doors and into the night. The air outside was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the humidity of a gym. The parking lot was empty except for our two cars parked under the yellow halo of a street lamp, my sleek black sedan and her battered practical truck. We stopped at the curb. The transition back to the real world, to the separate lives of the crisis PR rep and the trauma surgeon, loomed ahead. But the tether held. "So," I said, the word hanging in the cold air. Patty looked at me, her hands shoved into the pockets of her hoodie. The harsh street lamp light washed out the shadows, revealing the exhaustion around her eyes, but also a new, steady brightness. "No more silent treatment," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No," I agreed. "I think we're past the nonverbal agreement." "Good." She took a step closer, invading my personal space one last time before the drive home. She reached out, her hand brushing my arm, a lingering, deliberate touch that promised everything. "Because I'm done watching you in the mirror." "Same time tomorrow?" I asked, the routine suddenly holding a thrill it never had before. "Don't be late," she said, walking backward toward her truck, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm not spotting you if you're late." I watched her taillights fade into the dark, red streaks painting the night, and realized the discipline of the iron wasn't about building armor. It was about building the capacity to endure this kind of intensity. The rivalry is dead. If you know the weight of a silence that lasts too long, subscribe for more stories.